Paul is one of the most influential figures in history, and he's also one of the most misunderstood. For centuries, he's been read as if he broke away from Judaism to start a new religion. But what if that picture actually obscures who Paul really was? Well, today I'm joined by Dr. Mark Nanos, one of the pioneering voices of the Paul within Judaism perspective. Mark's work has challenged deeply ingrained ideas that pit Paul against Judaism, and Mark has inspired many to see Paul as operating within the Judaism of his day. This perspective not only transforms how we read Paul, but it also carries powerful implications for Jewish-Christian relations. So in this episode, we'll trace the journey of this perspective, its past, present, and future, and we'll hear about Mark's latest projects, including his forthcoming book on Galatians. So this is going to be a rich conversation, so let's jump in. Hey, Mark, it's great to see you today and have you on the Bridge Builders Forum. So, hey, we've done a number of interviews like this through the years, but this is the first time having you on my podcast. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with you today. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for having me. Look forward to sharing with your listeners.
Yes, absolutely. So for those of you who tune into this podcast and engage my resources on Paul, you probably feel like you know Mark Nanos. I reference his work a whole lot. But for those of you who haven't heard of Mark Nanos or wondered who he is, let me just take a moment just to share a bit about him. So since the 1990s, Mark has been a pioneering voice for the Paul within Judaism perspective. Now, we'll talk about how that term actually came to be. But the big idea behind Paul within Judaism is that Paul functioned within the Judaism of his day, as opposed to outside of or against Judaism. So although a considerable number of voices now also promote this viewpoint, things were very different not that long ago. So Mark has written many articles and books on Paul, including The Mystery of Romans, The Irony of Galatians, and a volume of collected essays on Paul within Judaism that he co-edited with Magnus Zetterholm. I also want to mention that at this year's annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature, Mark's impact on New Testament studies for the past 30 years is going to be honored with a special roundtable session dedicated to discussing the impact of his work. So to put it mildly, that is quite an honor. So Mark, again, it's really great to see you and have you on today.
Thank you. Look forward to talking.
Absolutely. Okay. So Mark, today, we're going to talk about important features of Paul within Judaism and where things are going with this paradigm. But I'd love to get our conversation started by just having you share a little bit of your story. I think folks will find it interesting and perhaps even inspiring that you became a scholar a little bit later in life than many do. You were a longtime business owner, but then you decided to pivot and become a New Testament scholar. So I'd love just for you to share a little bit about how this happened and really what inspired you to not only enter the academic world, but to challenge a lot of deeply held ideas about Paul. So tell us a little bit of your story.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. For those who might want to have more at length, I did publish an article after a lecture at University of Lund in 2019. It's published in a Swedish theological journal. It's in English, called Why Paul? So a brief version is my own story with Paul really starts in the mid-1970s when I went back to school to do a Jewish studies degree, when I had started a small graphic arts firm with another guy. And I was interested in, it was Roots was on TV. I was interested in my roots and what Judaism was all about. I wasn't raised in a religious household. And while doing a class on eschatology and apocalypticism, it became really clear how much Israelites and Jews argued with each other and pointed fingers usually at the leadership, often the religious leadership, that is the priests in the case of the temple and so on, who were the elites and who this criticism might even include things like Isaiah or Jeremiah or somebody saying, I don't care, God doesn't care about your sacrifices, or
Right.
things like this that sound pretty radical. And it struck me that from what I knew about Paul, he'd been interpreted as one from outside throwing stones. A comment like that from Paul would mean that he didn't think the sacrificial system had any worth and that people should not do it. But you don't read the Hebrew scripture figures. I mean, it may be the case that the temple wasn't operating at any given time, or who knows what. But the point is, you don't read it that way. You understand the context. And I had once heard a Christian preacher on a radio channel saying something like, some people say I'm a Baptist, but I'm not really a Baptist. I'm a Christian. And so, all the Baptists know he's a Baptist minister, so he can say that. Right. And so anyway, it was in that kind of context. And I had lived in Greece as a teenager, so I could function with not that well, but I could read lexicons and things. And I decided to do a paper for this class that asked if the title was All Israel Will Be Saved, and it had some subtitle. And the question was, if we read Romans 11 and challenged the translation a little bit, and I was influenced by, when I went to the library, Johannes Munk. I didn't know Christopher Stendhal. It was before the New Perspective developed. Didn't know about that either. But Munk kind of was confirming in the direction that I was going, which was translated from the Danish into English. So it was odd, and it was much more theological than I was interested in. But it gave me the encouragement. I wrote this paper, and my ideas changed a lot later when I came back to this. But when I finished my degree, I just pursued my business career. Had a small business and a small family, and the prospect of going to graduate school wasn't great, moving to the East Coast and so on. So the advice I got was, why don't you pursue this in the rabbinic gentleman scholar tradition? And since you're going to tell the Christians they're wrong about Paul, and you're going to tell the Jews they're wrong in their reaction to the Christians' construction of Paul, you're never really going to find a good job. You're probably not going to succeed at this task. So try to do it as a gentleman scholar, and then you can say whatever you want, and maybe nobody pays any attention, and so on. So during the 80s, later 80s, during that time, it's important, I think, to my own story that I continued to read sometimes when I could about Paul and think about this idea that I had of offering a different reading of Paul. And part of Jewish studies, of course, in the 70s, was still pretty raw in Holocaust studies. And over the years, over the 80s, I just realized that if I was right about this historical insight, it would have a profound implications for human history. And one person, Sense, I have to give credit to, made the comment to me once during physical therapy and said, so what you're trying to do is save the Jews from Christian theology. Now, we could tear that apart. It's not exactly head on, but it does get at why I continued to be interested in Paul and in doing this. It wasn't just because I had a historical insight, but because this historical insight had profound humanitarian consequences if I was right. And at that time in the 80s and in the early 90s, when I started to write what became a book about Romans, I thought it was just going to be an article. I mean, I wasn't a scholar, and I was a businessman, and I didn't know who my audience would be or if anybody would publish it. But it became a book, and we don't need to talk about that so much. But during that time, and when I came back to the investigation, it was profoundly disturbing, I guess, that the New Perspective had developed during the late 70s and 80s, pretty much unbeknownst to me. I read mostly Jewish materials. And
So this is like Dunn and Sanders and people like
yes,
that. NT Wright, they're doing their
that's
thing.
right.
They're really getting their footing,
Right.
and their stuff is really
Yeah.
getting a hold. Yeah.
So in the
Okay.
early
And it's the
90s,
'80s, but for you, this is still
yeah,
a hobby at this point, right?
exactly. I just think about it when I get a week off and go on vacation or have a sleepless night. What if people didn't have this idea about works righteousness? What and these concepts of Jews and Judaism as the other by which to measure the values, positive values of Christianity, and what if, as I learned a little bit later to think of it, but I realized I was thinking this way. What if we really read this as Jewish literature and put it on the map like we do other Jewish literature, and we realize it's intra-Jewish, just as intro African Americans can say certain things that are not appropriate for someone else to
Sure.
say. And Paul's been read as that someone else saying those things. And the Jewish
Mm-hmm.
reaction to that only strengthens the conviction that these are two incompatible ways of being and religious identities. And, one behavior supposedly is about faith and the other's about doing the right thing. And these things just didn't seem to me like what reading Paul confirmed. He seemed to me he belonged on that Jewish map. But I got to tell you, it didn't look very promising to communicate that. And one of the reasons I didn't go to graduate school, which continued to be even more a problem later on, is to argue that Paul misunderstood Judaism, or his interpreters did, as I was hoping to argue, would require advanced degrees in rabbinic literature, Second Temple Jewish literature, and so on. And I didn't have the time or probably the facility to do that. And so I just tried to focus on Paul and what I could bring to that from Jewish studies and from psychological social identity theory and so on, and just to think about it differently. It's kind of a working hypothesis. If you just say, as I was saying, if the people knew Paul was Jewish and behaving in Jewish ways, and they knew that they were part of a Jewish group being enculturated into Jewish ways, even though there were many of them that were non-Jews that the letter was directed to, if you just make that hypothetical move and say, what if we read this text with that set of assumptions? What will happen?
Right.
And that's kind of what I pushed. But I got to tell you, at the time, it really looked crazy. And the reaction, I didn't know scholars, but when I learned about the SBL while I was writing History of Romans and started to go to meetings, and, some people were very kind and welcoming to a Jewish businessman dabbling in Paul studies. It's probably not the first time, and it might have seemed kind of cute. And some were really put off and started what they still do, just a string of passages that anybody who had any competence at all would know that this is a stupid hypothesis to even bother with. So I met a lot of that, and
Sure.
But I was determined because I could see there's a humanitarian, and I could see the historical viability of it. The more I worked on translation and the more I read other people and saw where they made these moves that were not necessarily logically compelling moves. And so that was my early.
That's the early part.
Yeah, and
but
when
then you went on and got your PhD, right? You did eventually decide to do your advanced studies.
Yeah, Mystery of Romans was published by Fortress Press, which at the time in 1994 when I submitted it to them, they didn't expect it, and it was like a shot out of the blue. It got favorable remarks from some people, especially Christopher Stendhal, which was a very important endorsement. Yeah. And the book was published, and it had a lot of reviews, and including Society of Biblical Literature, Catholic Biblical Association, and so on. And so I had the opportunity to teach. I was invited to teach in Birmingham, England, and I enjoyed that too. And so I decided to think seriously about getting a PhD. And I thought I could still retain my business and do this still kind of as a hobby, but that didn't work out. As you take your eye off your business, you start to have issues. And so I decided to do the PhD. I did it at St. Andrews in the late 90s under Philip Essler was my supervisor. He was into social identity theory. His views of Romans and Galatians, he wrote books around that time, were very different than mine. And so that was a good, and he was a trained lawyer. So that was a good place for me to try to hammer this out.
Yeah.
And things were starting to change in some respects. There were some other voices, but not many in the 90s. And most of my articles that I submitted to journals and stuff came back from the peer review saying, in nice words, academic words, that this is crazy. Have you never read Acts this or that, or Galatians 3 this or that? So it was a rough road then. But I thought by the time I finished Romans and dabbled in Galatians, and I did a bit of a challenge on the Antioch incident at the end of my Romans book, I really thought it was viable. I did a full translation of Galatians, and I was going to do a book, but I did it instead as a dissertation.
Yeah, that's great. I love hearing your story, but I want to actually just press in a little bit more, and just for a moment about the early reception, because to give some context, if you walk into this year in Boston at the Society of Biblical Literature, you walk into a Paul within Judaism session, whether it's this year, last year, really over the last 10 years, I think I've been at most of the ones over the past 12 years, actually. The room's full. It's packed. It's buzzing. There's a lot of energy and excitement, from people who are maybe adherents, people who are not persuaded, and everything in between. Right. But my understanding, from you and hearing the stories of others, is that things have come a long way since the 1990s, this period you're talking about, when you were introducing some of these ideas. So I guess what I hear you saying is that really early on, there was just no category for this idea. And so you got a lot of pushback, right?
Yeah, I really did. I had to have a lot of clarifying conversations, because it became easy to put me in the category of new perspective, and which I did to myself actually at first, because it at least got rid of the works righteousness kind of thing. And it took me a little while to kind of get uncomfortable with what it switched to. But other people had trouble categorizing me. And so then I kept having to say, because normally people would say, if they ask, well, of course, Paul was a Jew, nobody's really complaining about that except maybe some Nazis or something like that. So, but then I had to press it. I said, yeah, but what I mean is, for example, he didn't have a BLT. He didn't do it in order to reach the BLT eaters. He was kosher. He was a very Jewish guy. And that's hard to define, of course, Torah observant guy, because it can be different in different locales and so on. But whatever that locale is, whatever it would be, I think he was very much like that, which was not a reflection of me. I was never like that.
Sure.
But I think he was. And I think holding that line and making that clarification with people. I'm not talking about that he was a Jew, born a Jew, that it still mattered to him in some kind of ethnic way. But he actually was promoting a Jewish way of life, a kind of Judaism, messianically oriented after his revelation. And it would be easily misunderstood by the people coming into it and by others, because he held a certain line of ethnicity, an ethnic line that these non-Jews coming in represented the end of the ages, when all of the peoples who were supposed to be blessed through Abraham and his seed, would also be among the children of Abraham. They would be turning back to the creator God's a better category in a sense. But as I realized this, and as I talked to people about it, the pushback was generally pretty strong, even from people that would maybe like to go down that road a little bit, could see definitely the benefits of changing the way Christians talked about Jews and Judaism and getting rid of some of the binary contrasts that seem important to Christian identity. Even people who could see the value of that, they still, and to this day, many still have trouble really to push it all the way to say it really mattered to Paul as a covenant obligation to observe the Torah.
Yeah.
and not in a reform Jewish way, but in some kind of orthodox, what it might even be called ultra, because he was an extremist kind of personality pushing this principle and others. And I think if we take him as an extremist Torah-oriented interpreter who would be widely recognized by anybody as very, very meticulous about observing Torah obligations, granted different interpretations of this or that point, but whatever they were, he'd be on the rigorous end. There aren't many people still comfortable with that.
Yeah, I think the way you said it a couple minutes ago was this idea you don't really get much pushback, and it's interesting to hear even then you didn't get much pushback on the idea that Paul was a Jew ethnically, and that certainly that's a key feature. No matter what angle one is coming from, understanding that his ethnicity is important. But when you cross over the threshold of this guy was as you just put it, very scrupulous and rigorous in his observance of Torah as apostle of the Gentiles. That is what I hear you saying. That's what really challenged people's assumptions and categories, and really is in many ways what has defined a lot of your work, is making that argument.
That's right. I do. I think even to this day, you read people conflating, as New Perspective did it in a very highly articulated way. Dunn is famous for saying circumcision, food laws, and Sabbaths or calendar observances, and conflating those. And I think I saw very early on, and have continued to think it's really important to discriminate. Circumcision is not like the others. You don't get circumcised every week. You get circumcised once. It's an initiation ritual.
Right.
And little Jewish baby boys at 8 days old don't choose it. It's their parents who choose it for them. And to conflate that with behavioral norms for Jews that choose to do worship according to a calendar and orient their life according to certain food and other kinds. Those are just high profile indicators. So the point is that I try to still make, and I still have to make it a lot, I think, to communicate. It's kind of an aha moment to realize, I think, that a non-Jew or a Jew can eat as Jewishly as they want and do all the calendrical observances more than any other Jews in a congregation. But a non-Jew doesn't become a Jew thereby. They become
Right.
Jewish-like. Yeah. But they don't become a Jew. And this is a bit of a problem with Jewish as an adjective, because we tend to think that means a Jew. But Jewish as an adjective could be a Jewish non-Jew. That is Jewish-ish, just to make the point.
Yeah.
Right? Who behaves Jewishly. We can imagine this with a Catholic church, and it's a good analogy. A non-Catholic could out-Catholic all the Catholics and be there for decades, but they're not entitled to the sacraments. They're not a Catholic. And it's not exclusivistic. I mean, it can be. It's depending on personality, but there's a way to be included, and it's been developed in a certain ritual process that if you're serious and you want those goods, then you make the transition. It's a religio-ethnic kind of transition in the case of Jews, because you have a Jewish person who doesn't behave Jewishly is still Jewish. A non-Jewish person who behaves Jewishly is still non-Jewish. That's not how it's done. And according to the Hebrew Bible and most Jewish tradition, prior to the Greek period, just a couple hundred years before Paul's time, there's no talk and there's no rituals described for a non-Jew to become a Jew or a non-Israelite to become an Israelite. They could act that way, and they could be included as guests and very honored guests, and they could marry and so on. We have these, even Moses marries a non-Israelite. So we have these right there in the text, but we don't have proselyte conversion. That comes up later. It's a tradition, and you can argue about it. And I think this has really been an important part of my later discovery, not the earliest one. It was a hint. I would mention it here or there, but in the last few years, I've really focused on this, that what Paul is arguing about from Torah is that Torah doesn't teach this. And so he's actually teaching against proselyte conversion, and he uses the synecdoche, like White House is a synecdoche for, we understand we're talking about the government executive
Right.
branch. When we use circumcision, it's a synecdoche for the closing aspect or the completion of proselyte transformation for a male, adult male. Anyway, the circumcision issue is totally different. I think getting that straight, that in the case of talking to non-Jews about circumcision and resisting circumcision, Paul is not talking about food laws. He's not resisting food laws. If they're coming into Jewish groups that eat Jewishly, then I expect they're eating Jewishly. That's what you would do. That's just natural behavior. And they're getting oriented to a Jewish calendar. And Paul sometimes refers to something prior to Pesach, or he's got to get somewhere. How would they know about that unless it's a part of their communal life? There's lots of things we could talk about. That's
Sure.
the big transition, is to recognize there's something between rituals associated with a transformation, a religio-ethnic transformation, which can be disputed between every Jewish group. It's an interpretation because it's not in Torah, but just because it's not in Torah doesn't mean you can't adapt to that. I think Paul adapted to that as a Pharisee and was probably, at what he's trying to say about his zealousness and being more than his peers, is he probably was the guy going out and making proselytes. And his revelation was not to do that anymore, because the end of the ages has arrived, and there's not just Israel as the people of God, but the other families of the earth are coming into the family alongside Israelites of the family of God, family of Abraham, not the family of Jacob. They're not Israelites.
Yeah.
And this is an important distinction that he thinks this community thereby demonstrates its propositional claim that the end of the ages has happened. Because there's no empirical evidence anything changed with Jesus dying and supposedly rising. And it's not a matter of unfaith to not believe in something that there's no empirical proof for. And when it grows into Christianity as something that's actually counter the faith of a Jew, it's not about believing something. It's about, hey, that's not faithful to believe in something that you just make up. It sounds crazy. It's a claim. Paul, I think, was trying to create an empirical reality. If this is true, as I believe it is, and as you who've become given allegiance to Jesus as Messiah from the other peoples, if this is true, you need to live accordingly. How do you live in the age to come? Well, Isaiah, the metaphor of the wolf lies down with the lamb. There's still wolves and lambs, and in the present age, that's not good for lambs, which would be Israelites or Jews in this metaphor. But in the age to come, this is what changes. They're still different, but the discrimination and so what Paul was trying to do then in these letters is to get people on board that you don't become proselytes. It doesn't matter if other Jews and non-Jews, which is a whole nother conversation, why would respond negatively to your claims. But it doesn't matter. This is what you have to do. You need the Spirit of God to empower you to live remaining different, women and men. Can you imagine masters and slaves to treat each other as equals in the assembly? I mean, we don't talk about that enough. That's pretty darn radical and almost, I think you can say, impossible. And so this is where the Spirit of God comes to play. If it's the age to come, then the Spirit of the age to come needs to enable you to live this way. You need to be committed to it, and blah, blah, blah.
Right. And so Paul he's persuaded that the end of the ages have broken in. And so in his mind, look, this is the era that the prophets spoke of, especially, Isaiah. Of course, he quotes more than Isaiah, but Isaiah is a big one for him. And in Isaiah's vision, there's Israel and there's the nations, there's Jews and there's Gentiles. So it would be, for him, it would be contrary to the reality that the end of the ages have broken in for Gentiles to become Jews. So they have to remain as Gentiles because, in order, because that's consistent with his claim that era has started.
That's right. It started, but it's not obviously here in full empirical reality. And this creates some conundrums, some things he has to try to solve.
Sure.
And this very notion, it's not just a egalitarian notion. It's a notion that, most egalitarian movements try to get rid of differences and make everybody the same. But to try to not be the same, I mean, that's part of the American experiment too. And right at the moment, it's a little broken in a serious way. But part of the American experiment is the same, that we don't have to all blend to one thing, but the natural instincts are the majority group, in this case, a Jewish group that you've entered. It eats a certain way. It behaves a certain way. It has certain days that it does things, and certain behavior that's guided by Torah, and different interpretations of Torah in different communities, of course. Now this subgroup has it's a subgroup of the larger Jewish community, and it has its own messianic hermeneutical issues or halakhic issues that it has to decide. How do we do this? And that's going to create a lot of mess, a lot of resistance for all kinds of reasons, even by people open to it. I actually think it's important to realize other Jewish people might well say, hey, listen, we feel sympathetic for a nice Jewish boy that the Romans crucified, and we feel sympathetic for you for whatever this crazy guy passing through your town in Galatia told you. We feel bad for you because you're not fitting in the way you'd like to because of your expectations. Let's just help you. Hey, listen, this is the way it is. You can have that and believe that and this, but the propositional claim you're making, it might be true someday. We can imagine a day like Isaiah envisions, but it's not today. And when you act like it's today, you impose your social behavior that's deviant on the larger community. And in this case, it has political ramifications because if you're a non-Jew, you're not free to give up the practice of your local heroes and gods and the imperial cult behavior appropriate as a Roman occupied people or a Roman part of the Roman system. And there is a way you could become members of the Jewish people, and therefore you could do that, but Paul doesn't let them. So he's not there in those cases, and these people have to figure it out. And one way to reduce this dissonance is to just have both. It's like a teenager with his peers. They say, well, your parents say you can't get a tattoo, but you just get a tattoo where your parents can't see it, where the sun don't shine. You won't be in it. You'll fit in, but your parents don't have to know. You can have your cake and eat it too. And you see, like in Galatia, that's what he thinks is the temptation.
And I know you're working on a Galatians within Judaism book, and I want to ask you about that a little bit. But I want to underscore too, Mark, something I think that's such a really important feature and emphasis in your work and other Paul within Judaism scholars is just the importance of time, the time on Paul's watch. And I think what you said is so important, that other Jews who were not persuaded regarding the who Jesus is and these claims that Paul and others were making, they might have been sympathetic to some of Paul's ideals and so forth. But the big thing was, in their minds, they didn't feel like the time was appropriate. Right. That sort of this end of the ages, these realities had not broken in yet. And so I think that that factor of time really is something that's a huge factor. What time is it on God's watch? And Paul's watch and the watches of other Jews who were not persuaded like he was, obviously were reading quite differently. Would you say that's a good way to frame it?
Yeah, no, I think it's good. And one of the interesting things about this is this part is not that controversial. I mean, traditional Pauline scholarship recognized realized eschatology was a big phrase in the 20th century. So this idea that Paul thought the age to come had broken into the present age, that itself is not that radical. There's not that much pushback from that.
Yeah.
The difference is recognizing the political dynamics that this created in these assemblies, if they're placed inside of Jewish subgroups, not just resistance from Jewish people, but from the non-Jewish relatives whom they should represent, their gods and so on, that they feel threatened by, and recognizing that by holding this line, you're creating a very different kind of dynamic than by placing this as Christianity as a new development, a new thing that's separate, and often sort of privileges itself as if there is an empirical change that Christians don't. I mean, I still read this in my normal Paul readings. Every
Hmm.
time it's that I
Yeah.
read something, this idea that somehow the Torah wasn't able to get people from sinning, the Torah wasn't sufficient, or Judaism wasn't sufficient, but Christ is. Well, excuse me, but where's that empirical evidence that
Right. Right.
that Christians are empirically different, that they've had a ontological change in which they just
Yeah.
automatically don't sin in ways that Jews were not able to do by trying to
Right.
observe Torah. Now Christians can just observe love in the fullest sense, as if they're ontologically, this is a superior system and that they're superior. And
Right.
so when you really wrestle with the way I'm trying to say it, is you have to enact this. Um, and that's the same thing that Torah is teaching. You have to enact this. It's not enough to just go do some sacrifices. You have to actually
Right.
have a circumcised heart. You have to care about the migrant and the poor person. And you have to care about the widow and the underprivileged. And what they're criticizing is a system that doesn't do that, which sounds unfortunately a bit too familiar right now. And
Sure. Sure.
this is the context that I think makes a big difference about the timing. As you focus on the timing is so important, but what is it he's claiming? And what we're doing in Paul within Judaism is different than the tradition, even though the tradition also focused on timing. So I just want to make that point. That's not really
Yeah.
it's not a distinction for us that say that the
Yeah.
end of the ages has entered, but it's to say it's entered within a Jewish subgroup. And how does that
Yeah.
Jewish subgroup tease out Torah observance and calendrical observance and so on when it's telling non-Jews that they're full equal members of the people of God in a hierarchical society, much more hierarchical than American society, for example? Your students come into class and they pick where they want to sit. Well, that's not how it worked in Galatia or
Yeah.
Rome, Corinth. And so if they suddenly have a group that's arranging the table and treating people in a way that's not the normal conventions for that, they have to answer for that. That's very disruptive. And it's a
Sure.
threat to the gods and to in the case of non-Jews, and it's a threat to Jewish communal life. And so that's what's so radical about the
Yeah.
end of times kind of claims they're making. That I tried to coin the term, I don't know if it's going to catch on or not, of chronometrical, meaning, the Gospels makes a chronometrical claim. And that's central to trying to understand what the Gospel is about. Actually, where Paul speaks of the truth of the Gospel in Galatians chapter 2, he's talking about this truth that non-Jews sit at the table as equals with Jews in Christ in their subgroup assembly. That's the truth of the Gospel that he's fighting for.
Yeah. And that's that's a very destabilizing
Yeah.
social adjustment. I
Yep.
mean, wow. If you're enjoying this conversation, I want you to know that the Bridge Builders Forum is more than just a podcast. We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping Jews and Christians better understand their faith, the Bible, and each other. And your support helps us host these vital conversations and create educational resources and interactive learning experiences. And yes, all donations are tax deductible. To give, just visit bridgebuildersforum.com and click donate. Every gift makes a difference. So thanks for standing with us. And if we can serve you in any way, send us a message. We've talked a little bit already about, this term, Paul within Judaism. And with any school of thought, adherence to a particular school or shul or perspective can be categorized together as if they agree on all points, right? But that's definitely not the case
Right.
with those associated with the Paul within Judaism perspective. It really is made up of a broad spectrum of people who see many things differently. But Mark, what do you see? What are some of the commonalities? For somebody who says, "Hey, I embrace a Paul within Judaism perspective." Of course, that can mean different things to different people. But
Yeah.
what would you say are some of the main ideas of Paul within Judaism that really differentiate it, say, from the new perspective, or certainly from more classical forms of Christian theology?
Mm-hmm. That's it should be easy to answer, but it's actually quite difficult to answer. And with every passing year, actually, since we coined this term for the Society of Biblical Literature sessions and the book that grew out of that was published in 2015, that phrase kind of helped us pull together and distinguish from the new perspective. We were looking for a title actually for the book, is how I came up with it, because I was saying, well, people were calling beyond the new perspective or the radical new perspective, and radical didn't make sense to me because I think radical is what they've done with Paul. If I'm right about what Paul is, then we're just doing the normal Paul perspective. And the radical thing is to have made him into a Gentile who's converted away from Judaism and Jewish values to something else that's really Gentileness. It's like whiteness for Americans is like waspness. Gentileness is so privileged they don't even realize that the logical problem in this Paul construction. Anyhow,
sure.
As we gathered around this at Society of Biblical Literature, we had a lot of sessions just asking, what does this mean? What does it not mean? What are the problem texts it raises, and what are the logical issues it raises in interacting with other texts, and so on. We're still in that process. It's being broadened out to within Judaism, New Testament within Judaism. People each of the Gospels now, and there's a Society of Biblical Literature session on Matthew within Judaism, and a book from that. There's several on John and sessions in John that do it. Hebrews has been, Acts, of course, is a natural one because it's the life of Paul, and he's very Jewish in Acts, and others too, Revelation, and so on. So that it's grown into something broader. So to talk about within Judaism is even more difficult than where it began, because it began with just a sort of a relatively simple paradigm shift. And I think anybody that's willing to make that basic paradigm shift has a certain amount of right to call what they do within Judaism, even if I might otherwise strongly disagree with the way that they do it. And there are some of those. There are people arguing for Paul within Judaism without Torah, for example. I don't agree with that, but the within Judaism part is just trying to make sense of him like you would any other Jewish figure and Jewish group, which is not what any constructions of Paul since the 2nd century that we know of have ever done. So that's what the simplest part of it is. Lots of other aspects, I would say, are common currency, but they don't have to be, and they might change in over the years. For example, it's common for Paul within Judaism or New Testament within Judaism people to focus on the audience profile and to recognize that Paul's imaginary or intended or target audience, the people that he's visualizing, that he's talking to, are the non-Jews present in these groups. Now, for most people, many Paul within Judaism and New Testament within Judaism people, this means they're Gentile churches, that there's no Jews there. Paul's not teaching Jews. It's never meant that for me, as you know, but for your listener to know, I have always thought that it's a Jewish movement, and there may be more Jews than there are non-Jews in these groups. It's just not them who have to be reoriented in the ways that these particular letters that we have were designed to do. And they're listening in, and he's trying to instruct them, indirectly, of course, but he's instructing non-Jews. And that's a common aspect of the approaches in Paul within Judaism scholarship. And it's very important because one of the biggest pushbacks immediately is for Christians, traditional evangelical oriented Christians, which includes the major, evangelical Lutheran and so on, Presbyterian. One of the sensitive spots right away is, but everyone's a sinner. He's got to be talking to everyone in Romans. Everyone needs Jesus Christ to be saved. Everyone's a sinner. Well, that is an implicit threat that comes up in the logic of just focusing on the audience. But, if I'm talking to a room full of students at the university and I want to make the point that it's really important that you're here on time and you're ready to, you've done your readings and so on. And I might be having to repeat that several times in the early part of the semester. And 90% of the room I'm not talking to.
Yeah.
And they know it. They're still
Sure.
getting support for what I expect. But the people that hopefully are burning a little bit are the people that keep coming in late and disrupting the class and so on. So most of us focus on that, but it's not required. I mean, if the text took us
Yeah.
somewhere else, we I hope that we would, as good historians and people with some ethical concern, to not make the text say something that they don't say, even if we would
Right.
prefer they did. So that's the problem with defining this. For me, I think these have to be very Jewishish groups. That's the only way
Yeah.
it makes sense of the kinds of things Paul addresses and what he doesn't have to address. He doesn't seem to be accused of misbehaving, nor do his other people. They're being either accused or resented or something for not doing it the you might say the conventional or customary way of the time in those groups, which were undergoing a lot of changes. And, it's just before the temple's destruction and so on, but lots of stuff was in the air, and it wasn't bad to be a Jew generally in the Roman Empire. It was kind of good. It was kind of like maybe you might think of Amish or Mennonites in American culture. They're weird, but they're good people
Yeah.
for the most
Yeah.
part.
Yeah, and their rights to worship are protected, right? And
Yeah,
so Jews
exactly.
had the ability to worship. They might have
Yeah,
Greco-Roman
yeah,
citizens.
yeah.
Your average person would have thought they were a little strange, and maybe but at least they had the right to do what they did.
One of the problems is looking backwards. That changed after the Jewish people, the Judeans, rebelled, and the temple was destroyed. Naturally, kind of like after the Twin Towers, some people's objections to Islam or Muslim practicing people or Arab people or so on were affected by that. Then there was an even bigger one, under Hadrian's period, the Second Revolt, and the end result of that was to throw all the Judeans out of Judea and to tax for being Jews, which had started earlier, and a lot of other negative policies. And then being a Jew or a Jewish group wasn't necessarily as easy or as respected or as attractive to non-Jews as it had been at Paul's time. And I think that's really important to recognize. Jews were really pretty much respected as, you could trust your children to watch your kids
Yeah,
with Jews. And they're not hypocrites. They're very sincere people. They're blah, blah, blah. They have some weird ways, but
sure.
anyway, I think
Yeah,
that's important for the reception of Paul and trying to
very
understand
important.
within Judaism early on. Now, when we talk about the New Testament, we get into some later aspects where within Judaism is changing after the temple and after the Bar Kokhba revolt and in the 120s. And so then you have different sets of dynamics, and we begin to get the Christian polemics of the mid to late second and third centuries, and things change in many ways. I hope that helps. So it's just a basic. Do you think Paul converted from Judaism to something we call Christianity, that he thought it was inferior and or harmful to do it? Then you're not doing Paul within Judaism, in my view.
Yeah, yeah,
How you do other aspects after that, okay, different. But that's kind of the paradigm shift in a simplest kind of way. And it's not just about Paul, but it's situating what the other person expects how they expect to decode what Paul's writing about. Right. So
yeah, yeah. Got it.
if Paul's writing against eating ice cream, and they all know that they eat ice cream with Paul, they have to then think, what on earth does he mean? Well, they're eating ice cream in some way that's unfair to the people who can't afford ice cream, maybe, or something, but not the conclusion that he's against eating ice cream.
Eating ice cream. Right, right. Yeah,
That's the switch. It's not just conception of Paul, but a conception of what the readers know about Paul, and that the movement they're in is a Jewish movement. That to
yes.
me is the
And I
paradigm.
want to ask you to drill in just for a moment on one aspect of that you alluded to briefly that I think is so important that I think just a lot of I think this is an important feature of your work in particular, in that you make the case that by and large these groups that Paul was writing to, it's typically framed as, hey, Paul was planting churches, writing to churches, all these kinds of ways that it's typically articulated and framed. But you use a very specific way of conceptualizing it. You call them, Paul was writing to synagogue subgroups. I mean, that right there
Right.
really changes how we envision the dynamics, because
Yeah.
then you've got, these early Gentile Christ followers. They're very much, they're on, they're like on top of, they're part of the Jewish community in a sense in these
Right.
early
Right.
stages. So that's really an important feature, wouldn't you say, for understanding Paul in his context?
It is from my Paul within Judaism reading.
Yes.
I would still say to this day that is not common.
Mm-hmm.
You might even occasionally now find it stated, but you can see the person not really conceptually there as they
Yeah,
proceed. And it's a big change,
it
and
is.
it's easy to understand that the people who care about Paul the most are Christians, and they're in churches, and they want to understand what this means for them. And
Sure.
unfortunately, in some cases, in the very conservative end, they think they can read straight off of it without the cross-cultural stuff that's required, both in languages and cultures of thousands of years of what it's changed, what Christianity means, and what it wants these texts to mean for them. And so it's easy to
Yeah.
understand that this is really hard. But to me, this is a critical element and a somewhat still very, very much a minority view, even amongst within Judaism scholars, to really think of this as within Jewish communities. Yeah, as
Yeah.
subgroups.
Yeah.
And the kind of dynamics that creates are fascinating. I don't know why it's not worth exploring it, even if you're not persuaded going in. It
Yeah.
raises all kinds of different, like in feminist studies, it raises some fun things that Kathy Ahrensberger has explored in her work by
Mm.
situating this and looking at other Jewish ways of including women's voices and so on.
Yeah.
It's actually possible that what Paul is doing, when you put it within Judaism, makes a lot more sense of what was happening probably in other Jewish groups where women did have more uh, of a voice than
Uh-huh.
in non-Jewish groups of the time. Not all of them. There might have
Sure.
been some mystery cult or
Yeah,
this.
right.
In general, on the street and in philosophical circles, um, the Jewish groups would be maybe a little bit more attractive to feminist scholarship. And if you put Paul on that, then he's not really so radical again. When you
Yeah.
measure him within Judaism, it's interesting to look at. And that's a new kind of developing area because, as you know, in feminist groups, generally, in feminist studies, generally, Paul's been the guy who, Jesus was integrating women and Paul stopped all that and he's more traditional. And then they look at
Right.
some rabbinic separation of women and that confirms, in that sense, it's kind of Jewish, but not in the good sense. And so
Yeah, yeah,
getting
yeah.
around those sorts of paradigms and ways of reasoning that are deeply ingrained and they're in everything you read and they're in the pastor's teaching and they're in the seminary classroom and they're just in the air. They're part of what we call
Sure.
ideology, right? They're deeply seated and you don't know about them until somebody comes along and kind of pokes at it. And you don't like that at first. It's not fun to
Right.
get poked
Right.
at, but people of
Yeah.
goodwill get poked at. And I hope myself and as well, that we
Yeah.
may not like it at first, but we need to say, well, I don't think I know everything. And some of the consequences of what we've done have been pretty harmful. Maybe it's worth exploring this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Mark, I want to drill in also on another area. I would say a major idea, a common idea among those who associate with the Paul within Judaism perspective. Again, a lot of these points are not held by all people, but a common one, and I know something you hold, is that Paul's writings, um, his application of the Torah address the needs of non-Jews, in particular. However, things can get very confusing with this issue, because on the one hand, especially in his letters, Paul appears to be on the one teaching a whole lot of Torah and promoting Torah concepts, one God, all these kinds of things, and so many other things. And he's promoting these concepts to his non-Jewish audience. And on the other, he makes some statements that sound and have been widely understood as very negative about the Torah, the nomos, the law. So, Mark, what would you? Of course, this is a massive topic, but I'd love for you just to comment a little bit about how. What are some thoughts about how we can sort this out? Was Paul pro Torah for Gentiles, against Torah for Gentiles? I think there's a lot of folks that are still wrestling with that, and maybe what's some of the nuance that can help us with that?
Thanks. I think it's a great question. It's a great area. And number one, the bottom line is it was messy for Paul, and he was trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
It's going to be messy for everyone thereafter. It's probably why the movement moved out of Judaism, which it eventually did. This is a messy, messy idea. When you, again, to use the Catholic analogy, of course, in a Catholic community, a Catholic church, you have non-Catholics who marry in or are very serious neighbors or have some kind of conviction, maybe had a vision of the Virgin Mary, whatever it would be, to meet with Catholics. And of course you Catholicize. And everyone there wants you to Catholicize. That's the ideal culture that you have.
Sure.
But if you started to tell non-Catholics, some priest, let's call him a rogue priest, who says, hey, you love Jesus, you're welcome to take communion. All of these other rules are later rules by an institution, and God loves you the same as a Catholic, and it's just not right.
Well, gears are grinding. Gears are grinding right there.
Exactly. And that's, now we go back and we try to think about what Paul's proposition, and I think it's shared, which, by the way, is another difference, but I hope it will change. I think that it's shared by James and Peter and John and so on. I think Paul is trying to explain. They share this view. They came at it independently, and they've got some different, given their different contexts, whether in Judea or not, they have some different ways of negotiating it. But they agree about this principle that the non-Jew must remain a non-Jew, not a member of Israel.
Yeah.
They are among them, to use the tree metaphor, which is one branch in that metaphor, is among the Jewish branches.
A single olive shoot.
It's just a little
precarious
shoot, precariously placed among them. And without talking about that so much, but the point is, when you are teaching non-Jews that they have to be Jewish-ish, this is a Jewish group. We believe in God who has given us the Torah, but it does not apply to you the same way, just as it doesn't apply to Jews and Judeans when they're outside of Judea, when they're not around the temple and so on. It changes as you go out in these concentric circles, and they're in the diaspora. And there's ways of doing Judaism in any given town that there's probably the Reform kind of folks and the Orthodox kind of folks and whatever. Well, Paul's in the Orthodox groups, subgroups, I think, and they're minority groups trying to negotiate this world. And these non-Jews are confused by this. And he is introducing them to think, what's the authority he appeals to in every letter? Torah. Scripture. Prophets. Traditions. He never, or almost never, appeals to what they've all read. Homer, the Aeneid, the various drama writers and poets and so on. That would be popular culture. Stoic popular culture. People find things he does that are similar to Stoics. I did some articles about similar to Cynics, but he doesn't quote them. The authority he quotes is Scripture. He's orienting them to righteousness all the time. I don't know how people can read Galatians and think it's freedom from the law, because if they would just read chapter 5 and chapter 6 of Galatians, that is law. That's tough.
Yeah.
That's saying you've got to behave all of these ways and not behave those ways, or you're not part of the kingdom of God. You're not. Yeah, you're part of the evil spirit, not the good spirit, and so on. I mean, he's enculturating them to a Jewish way of life. It's not hard to read him that way, but it's not the way he's been read. Is that messy? Well, yeah. We don't. One of the problems is, like, for Messianic Jewish groups, as you know, our understanding of Judaism is based on rabbinic Judaism, which didn't exist in Paul's time. So some of the rules and things, and whether they apply to Gentiles, the same question, do they apply to Jews? At the mid-first century when Paul was writing, were they even invented yet? And were they as important as they became given different contexts, including the Christian context?
It's not like there was a codified Noahide, system, I mean, not that that's even that well developed in rabbinic writings, but I mean, we don't have any evidence that was common, and circulating in Paul's day.
Exactly. So if you try to actually enact this in a modern group, it'd be very messy, but it was messy already for Paul's time. And it was a small movement. People think there's thousands and tens of thousands and millions. There were just a few, 10 and 20 and 30 people in a larger Jewish community of, let's say, a few thousand, in a larger non-Jewish community, let's say, of tens of thousands. So it's a minority group inside a minority group inside of the major culture. There's all sorts of ways for a person who gets into that to understand it, and for them to explain it, and for other people to understand it with rumor and innuendo and dislike and like. There's all kinds of personalities. We have liberal, welcoming personalities. We have closed down the other guy personalities. We have revengeful personalities. We have a loving personality. These are all factors too in group growth. So you just don't have an easy answer that people would like to have. I think the generalization, the hypothesis to ask is, can you read this text from the notion that Paul practices a Jewish way of life and promotes a Jewish way of life, Jewishishness for non-Jews? Can you read it that direction? And if you can, it's not going to answer all of the technical details, just as Torah did. That's why we have halakha. And just as the church, New Testament didn't, and we have church development of doctrines. And they change with times, maybe not as fast as they should, but they change with times. And so it's not a simple answer, but he was Jewish. He was making them Jewishish, but he was not allowing them to become Jews. That is complicated.
Right. It is complicated. And I know we'll probably get into that a little bit here more because I'm going to ask you about some of the features of your Galatians work, because you've got, I know you're working on getting out this Galatians within Judaism book. So we can maybe talk a little more about circumcision, just how massive that was, as far as, how the issues he had to sort out in relation to his non-Jewish communities. But before we even go there, Mark, I want to talk a little bit about translations, because this is something I know that you have really emphasized, the importance of the translations and how they impact just all of these assumptions. And we've discussed this a lot. And of course, you've been saying for decades now is, every translation is shaped by the assumptions of the translators. And one way you've put this is that as we get more specific regarding Paul and within Judaism, is that both translations and interpretations of Paul are governed by whether one views him as a Jewish apostle or a Jewish apostate. Two very different things. And whatever your assumptions are going to govern a lot of how translation and interpretation proceeds. So let's discuss this a little bit. How translations influence, let's just say, interpretive options even. And so I would say my question, to put this in the form of a question, how do mainstream translations restrict or limit the ability to see Paul as within Judaism? And maybe even give us an example of how this might flesh out.
Well, that they do should be pretty non-controversial. that including my own, everybody has some kind of reason that they're interested in these texts and therefore in translating these texts. And that would include
Sure.
a native Greek speaker, because the native Greek speaker today is still not using the same Greek. They have a better chance of using it, but they also have maybe more built-in mistakes because a word is used a certain way that has nothing to do with the original way, or you could get there with some segue. So we all face this cross-cultural problem.
Yeah.
And it can never be solved all the way. But we can't, for myself, I am not a philologist, so I'm reliant upon lexicons. The Greek lexicons that we use as scholars were influenced by Latin lexicons. Even though the Greek was earlier, it was Latin-speaking Christians who were Christians in the medieval period and since, who created the lexicons. And the glosses that they chose are influenced by Latin and by Christian ideology, Christian decisions. And not just, there's no such thing as Christian ideology. There's a certain kind of Catholic ideology, which might be different than the next Catholic administration wants it to be, and so on. And all through the years and the Crusades and all these things have influenced decisions. When Luther came along and emphasized certain things, you can find antecedents, including in Augustine, of things he emphasized, or Chrysostom or somewhere. But that becomes normative. Jerome, of course, his Vulgate translation was different than the previous Greek translations. And every translation is based on interpretation. You just can't get around that. Okay, so anybody who accuses that of circularity, that's true. It is. You have to posit something and you have to go explore it. The thing that's interesting in my own research, I can say, I have often found out, for example, my first book, Mystery of Romans, is a case in point. I couldn't translate everything, because translating, when you have a different paradigm, requires looking up every word, every phrase, every context, not just the way the word's used, but the way different philosophical groups used it, different religious groups used it, political groups used it. That's a whole lifetime just to do a small amount of that. And I didn't come at this with all those credentials. It's hard work for me, and I'm not a philologist. So I depend on these lexicons, right? And when I wrote Mystery of Romans, there were certain things I was hunting for and other things I was accepting that later, when I return to Romans every time and I'm looking at something else or something that never kind of really worked for me, but you just got to move on, I find out that I don't like what I had accepted before. And as you know, a big one was, that the branches are broken off of the olive tree.
Yeah.
It's in the Greek word, when you go look at it and you look at horticulture or olive culture, it just doesn't make sense that you can't be grafted among them if they're off the tree. The Greek word there is different than the word he uses later when he threatens that one branch with being cut off. The word can be bent or broken. It's used of a wrestler grabbing the toe of the other wrestler, and he clawed it. And that's
dislocated, right?
Dislocated. He pulled his toe, and the guy screamed, and he won the match. But nobody thinks he really pulled the toe off and is holding it up in the air, bleeding. And there's other examples. So, in fact, one of them is in Ezekiel, where a bird's wings are broken. I'm not Ezekiel, Exodus, where a bird's wings are broken in a sacrifice, but they're not pulled off of the bird. Anyhow, things like that I keep finding in my own work. One of the big ones was, as I've talked to you about, was a few years ago with sozo. I was going to do a paper. I was working on, do Jews need to be saved just like Gentiles, which is kind of a normal phrase you hear. And I was exploring this, and I sat up one night in bed thinking about it and realized, you haven't looked at the lexicons for sozo because you just learned the gloss like everybody else is salvation. And I got the thing.
So Mark, just to make sure folks know, we're talking about this critical passage in Romans 11, 25 and 26, which, a lot of people just have it in their back pocket. All Israel will be saved. And the word saved there is sozo. So you were challenging the way, we can, because, when people think all Israel will be saved, they think, most people's minds go immediately to like Christian salvation, like you were out, now you got to be brought back in.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
but please continue. Yeah.
Well, the way that the olive tree has always been translated and interpreted in Christian tradition feeds to that, right? They're broken
Yeah.
off, but they could be grafted back in. Well,
Yeah.
they're out of the covenant with God, and some people read Romans 9:6, as you know. They're not all Israel is Israel the way they read it, which again I've written about why that's probably improbable translation. In any case, you've already read this, and you're thinking now. You also read, "Have they stumbled so as to fall?" And the answer is no.
No.
It should be yes. If they're
Yeah.
broken so as to be broken off, they should have stumbled
Right.
so as to fall. And then you should get to this, and at least you would wonder, all Israel will be saved. Well, saved meaning they don't fall. They're stumbling.
Right.
Saved meaning they're bent, but they never die. They don't get broken off.
Right.
When a limb gets bent, it gets cracked and it forms a callus. Oh, by the way, the Greek word Paul uses that's translated hardened is actually understood as callus by Greeks of the first century. So a callus is a healing function. Yes, it gets hard, but it's not about hardness of heart. That's a different Greek word talking about Pharaoh. And you look these things up and you realize it takes the hypothesis to look at this differently. And then when you're going to look at it differently, you start looking up the translation, the choices that were made. And in some cases like this sozo, it is not it's not resuscitated. It's not resurrected. It's not brought back from the life. Could you use it that way? If you heard someone say the doctor saved him, you wouldn't think he died, but it could be used that way. But the normal thing when the doctor saves you from cancer means you didn't die.
Yeah.
He kept you safe.
He protected you. He kept you safe. He
right.
got you off the hook, whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. And so if you read this as all Israel will be protected, and you realize Paul is trying to protect them from these Christ-following non-Jews who are growing arrogant towards them, who he categorizes as a wild shoot that's arrogantly dismissing them, then you can recognize he's saying this is a weird process. And some Israelites are estranged for a while. They're not persuaded of this. It's not disobedient. They're not persuaded is the Greek here. And during this anomalous time, God's reaching out to you and bringing you in, and you ought to be grateful and humble and kind. This is what he's doing. So why wouldn't it be all Israel will be protected during this process? And I've shown in my reading Romans within Judaism, where these essays are collected, and in a few essays published since, that this is just, it would make sense. It's an alternative. And you can argue against it if you want to, but it's an alternative. It should be explored. Does it work with the text? Are these normal? In some cases, I'm choosing the more normal Greek usage, not some specialist one. Like the first time this is ever used this way is by Paul. Well, that should give you pause. And especially if it's loaded in a direction that happens to confirm a Lutheran theological position, that ought to give you pause, because that's a medieval context for trying to establish a word. Is it established that way in Latin lexicons? Maybe it is, because that's by medieval people writing it. So anyway, that's part of the process. And this is a critical process. And the Paul within Judaism and all the within Judaism stuff, which the name may change, it's not important. This basic movement paradigm, it's not going to reach its potential until it offers translations, because no matter how well-meaning or how convincing you find me today, when you start reading Galatians in the translations available to you, all of them, you will go, well, that doesn't look like Paul is supporting Torah. It looks like Torah is over. It looks like it was just a child pedagogos or something, and now it's done. He's died to it. All it does is stir up sin. And you're going to see all this stuff. And if you read Romans 11 after you listen to me, you're going to say it's broken off. It could be grafted back in, which means it had to be off. But that word can be translated, and normal translation of it is to be strengthened, to be encouraged. This whole thing, even the wild shoot, might not be grafted in. It might be the word could be being encouraged among them, being strengthened among them. That's a possible reading of that Greek word, a normal reading of it, not a specialized reading of it.
Sure.
Specialized reading of it is grafted. That's the unusual use. Anyhow, once you go through and you start doing this, if you listen to me and then you go back to your Romans 11, you're going to see they disobeyed God, which seems to suggest they know the truth about Jesus, but they rejected. How many people say the Jews rejected Jesus? And they ask me after a lecture, do you reject Jesus? That's that. To reject it means I believe it's true. Are you rejecting Muhammad? Well, you're not persuaded Muhammad's the prophet, and then you say, I don't care because I don't want to believe that. That's rejecting something. But if you say, I don't know, it's not my thing, I don't believe it, it's not in my Bible, it's whatever, you're not rejecting it, you're rejecting maybe the claims made for it because you're not persuaded of them. But if you're persuaded of them, that's a different thing and so the language that's normal for any Christian who goes to church or who reads these texts or reads people even like me, that's an unusual Christian, I would say. Then they look at their text in the Bible and they go, this guy's making stuff up. How can they repeat it to someone else and show them when the text doesn't? And so we won't really succeed until we take this on. And it's a major challenge. And one of the problems is, of course, we don't all agree. We agree on a basic paradigm thing, but when you get into the weeds, we're at different places.
Well, I think even an example that illustrates your point so vividly is just, let's even take the Jewish annotated New Testament, of which you're a contributor to that volume, and edited by Brettler and Amy Jo Levine. So, you're giving your commentary, pretty much chapter by chapter on these verses, but it's working with the Revised Standard Version of it. So it's like there's this constant, there's this, again, a grinding of gears because you're kind of having to really explain so much because the translation seems to conflict so much with what is being offered in the commentary.
That's a really good example. And just as a anecdote, when I submitted my manuscript for Romans for that some 15 or so years ago, 16, 17, it was so excessive it exceeded the word count by so much that the editors, were hard at work at cutting this down. And I was saying, there's no way for my reader to follow me without words because text looks like this and they already know it from all of their training. They already know they fill this stuff in. And the chief editor of the Bible section at Oxford University Press, he saw my manuscript where it had things that just been cut out, but he could read through it. And he said, we need these words because what he's offering is a completely different paradigm. And there's no way, just as I said to the editors, there's no way for them to follow this. And if you go read Galatians by Shia Cohen, it's very traditional reading of Galatians. If I was doing Galatians, it would be entirely different. Lots of places where he accepts the translation or the normal reading of Paul, I would be challenging. And that takes words because people already know the traditional way or even a newer perspective way. But to give them a totally different paradigm, you have to keep reminding them. You have to create a new vocabulary.
Words. That's it. It's like you're making a new language in many ways by uncovering the actual language. But I want to mention to folks that in Mark's book, Reading Romans Within Judaism, which is a collection of his essays, again, highly, highly recommend it. At the end of that, there's an appendix in which Mark includes his own translation of, I think it's Romans 11:11 through 12:1. And again, you give some expanded commentary on that. And that's just that appendix alone is well worth the price. So I want to encourage folks just as an example to see how this can be read and translated quite differently. So I just wanted to mention that real quick, Mark, before we move on.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. That was, and I think it can show someone just how painstakingly difficult it is to do and sustain, because there's just phrases. We know these phrases. How many times do you hear? But we're grafted into Israel. Really, human beings are grafted into the olive tree. Well, human beings are grafted into an olive tree. I think about the image. That's what they call a dead meadow. You don't even think about it anymore. But he
Yeah,
never
no,
calls
no,
the tree
well said.
Israel. He doesn't call the tree Israel, and it's just one. It's not a whole bunch like Calvin's picture. So just yeah, these are things that you got to explain because we don't in literary theory. There's the idea of before reading. Before you read
Mhm.
something, you have
Yeah,
expectations of it, and you don't approach
sure.
it
Of
the same. You don't
course.
approach a Bible the same or an encyclopedia the same way you do a journal article or a comic book or a novel. And so you come with a certain worldview and a certain expectation of those texts. And I do
Yeah,
too. And so I have to keep
yeah,
challenging myself and challenging my peers that are trying to do this together. And that always becomes kind of the sharpest challenges, right? Is, hey, we're on board. There's just a few of us. Let's catch each other
yeah,
where we fall into the old habits.
yeah, yeah. Well said. Um, Mark, you've done a lot of work as we've just discussed on Romans and Philippians, and you also have a book from 2001 in Galatians that called The Irony of Galatians, and then there's the Galatians debate as well. But I think folks will be happy to know, as I've already alluded to a couple times, that you're working on a new Galatians book called Reading Galatians Within Judaism. So let's just talk about that for a moment, as we've got a couple more things I want to talk about here before we wrap this up. But let's talk about Galatians. More than any of Paul's letters, Galatians, I think a case could be made that Galatians has been understood as Paul positioning himself outside of and even against Judaism. But of course, you have a very different take.
That's
So just if you could give us a few key ideas that you're going to present in the forthcoming book that will make the case that Galatians can be read within Judaism.
right. So I've published a lot of these essays on the Antioch incident, 4 different essays over the course of 30 years, actually, coming up. And then other essays on Galatians, some aspects of From Irony of Galatians, a chapter or two will be included. And then
Okay.
papers that I've done. And this is actually where the slowdown is, that some of the papers I've done really represented much lengthier parts of book projects that I haven't completed. And
Yeah.
between COVID and some other issues in the last 2 years, I'm just not making the kind of progress that I had been making. I've started a lot of other projects, including an introduction to Galatians that I essentially finished, but I wasn't happy with it. It had some limitations for word count and so forth for the publisher that I just wasn't happy with. And so I have a number of manuscripts, and especially another full manuscript on the allegory in Galatians 4 that reads it differently, and I've presented at Society of Biblical Literature and over the years, going back to
Yeah.
2003, some of these views. So one of the slowdowns to this book is that to be as comprehensive as I'd like it to be and up to date, I have to finish things that were not finished. And there's some fun articles in there. I did a paper in the 90s that no one would publish that I sent it to that was called Paul's Jerusalem Orientation in Galatians, in which I just went through the verbs that he uses when he speaks of Jerusalem. And so I'm actually working on that this past week, and hopefully in the next week or two I can finish it up. I wrote that and was seeking publication in 98 or 99. I actually had someone help me. Because you could no longer open it as a Word file. I had to go through quite a long process
Wow.
to put it back, and then all the Greek had to be replaced. And the other thing is that I wrote that in 1997 or 8, and well, it's 25 plus
Yeah.
years later, and really, since I did that, the idea of the theory of spatial relations in textual reading has grown into a whole discipline. So there's all
Hmm.
kinds of cool stuff there. And if I
Yeah.
try to now learn that and accommodate it into this little rather not that ambitious of a paper, this is the kind of problems that are causing the delay. But for example, just to show you what happens with Jerusalem reading within Judaism, just ask the question, why does Paul always go up to Jerusalem, even when he's north of Jerusalem, and he
Yeah.
doesn't descend to there? He always goes up to Jerusalem, and he always goes down from Jerusalem in his autobiographical comments in Galatians chapters 1 and 2.
Yeah.
Kind of interesting.
That is interesting.
And when you just look at simple things like this, you say, that's a kind of normal Judean, Jerusalemite, temple-oriented way of thinking about the world. That's the center of the world. Romans, we talk about Romans, but it's based on a city, Rome. And Second Temple Judaism was kind of based on Jerusalem and the temple. Other peoples have their centers too.
Sure.
The Samaritans, it's the mountain, Gerizim. So, and when you read their text, that's the highest mountain. And Jerusalemites talk about it's the highest mountain. Well, it obviously isn't the highest mountain, but it's a conceptual, theological concept of the way the world works. That's kind of just those little interesting things that betray a Paul who isn't the Paul that everyone knows. And so I hope in this volume, I don't know still what some things that I just should move on from and publish separately. I want it to be the best, and I don't know that I can do that and all the other things that I would like to do. So I think it's going to be, it's going to have some new stuff. I just don't know yet.
Good.
How much.
Okay. All right. Well, we're waiting with anticipation.
Yeah.
So
I just add one more thing. One thing it will include is my more recent work on ergonomu as
and that's critical.
Proselyte transformation, and that's going to be important for people to get.
It is, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with that term, ergonomu is the phrase that is typically translated in standard translations as works of the law. But Mark, you have a very different take. That's a whole can of worms, that really folks need to read to get the full line of thought. But again, you have a very different take that changes the game, because that sounds like, clearly Paul is against this, whatever this is, he's against it, but it when you translate it as works of the law, it sounds kind of like Paul is pretty generally against Torah, but you make the case in your paper, which will be included in this book, that ergonomu it's a much more specific reference to these customary rites of Gentiles undergoing proselyte circumcision. So I know that's a hard concept to put in a nutshell, but how'd I do?
No, but it's simple. It's actually so simple if it's right.
Yeah.
And every time you get to that, you could just gloss it, proselyte transformation or something like that. Just gloss it. I'm not saying that's the translation. I'm saying just think that way.
Sure.
And then you see other places where nomos is used that's translated law, and you translate that instead as proselyte transformation. If that's the topic, then Galatians, all these things that it looks like he's against law, going back to our earlier conversation and just talking about in the broad sense, they're not even about Torah. They're about something that's an addition to Torah in the Greek period, Greek and Roman period, that people could wrestle with, just like Jesus could wrestle with Pharisees about washing hands, which was not in Scripture in the way they were using it. It was a legitimate way to interpret it, but it's not the only way. And when Jesus disputes that with them, people don't think he's disputing whether Torah should apply, but whether that way of doing Torah should apply. And Paul is disputing that way of bringing non-Jews into full membership as an innovation that's not in Torah, and it's against what the gospel claims. So this group, I don't know if he cares about any other groups, but this group, you can't do that. And that makes a big difference on.
Oh man, it changes everything. It changes everything because it turns the version of Paul who was against Judaism and condemning Judaism and left his former way of life in Judaism as in a complete departure from to start something new. It challenges all of those deeply entrenched assumptions.
It does.
I want to kind of turn the corner here towards the end here, but again, we're looking forward to that when you're able to get it to the finish line. So looking forward to that, Mark. So, Mark, I want to ask you, you're a historian, you're a scholar, but something that you have in this conversation alluded to as well is you're very attentive to highlighting the implications of Paul within Judaism, in particular for the Jewish Christian relations and that dynamic. And of course, this is something just on a personal level I'm very passionate about as well, and really encouraging positive Jewish Christian relations is what this podcast and what my organization Bridge Builders Forum is really all about. So I want to talk about this a little bit. What are some of the implications of reading and interpreting Paul within Judaism for modern Jewish Christian relations? And really, how can this paradigm help Jewish Christian relations to move forward?
Yeah, significant. I mean, for me, I wouldn't bother with all of this on its own. I mean, if I didn't think it had this humanitarian thing, I had a perfectly fine life, and this could have been a hobby interest of mine or not. But I think it really matters and can offer a better way forward, a much better way forward, a totally different way of thinking. If Christians rethink their own identity, granted, it's anachronistic to think today you're not within Judaism. Today, there's Christianity. But
Sure.
When you read these texts, before you do the interpretive process, that hermeneutics is the fancy word for, of figuring out what it means for you today, if you start by thinking of it on a Jewish map as a Jewish way of being, that doesn't apply directly to you because your movement is not Judaism. Right. And you are not a Jew or a non-Jew coming into a Jewish subgroup of the first century. And it's not under Rome. It's a different world, and women roles aren't the same. Slave roles hopefully aren't the same, and so on. And given that, you for me, it's because it matters. And I saw something that I thought was a historical reality, a reasonable, more probable in historical terms, we talk about probability, than the traditions that were there. And I think the traditions that are there, here's a way of putting it. People of goodwill who would like to not talk about and behave towards Jews and Judaism the way that the Christian church traditionally did and actually, wanted its people to do. They have had to dismiss Paul's voice because they think his voice is in the opposite direction of what they would like, of what would seem right. Yeah. And what I think is that this offers those people who care about Paul's voice, who are not willing to go that direction, and people who care about Paul's voice, who are willing to go there, a corrective. It might be possible, not 100%. It's not the 21st century sensibilities, but it might be possible to find in this source encouragement to change that paradigm for Christians. Yeah. And Jews have a part to play too, because to the degree that Jews find the Christian paradigm as such a misrepresentation and such a nasty projection of Jews and Judaism, it can be useful to continue that binary contrast as the other and proud to be the other. And Paul can be used in that same way. That construction of Paul that Jews have is a Christian construction. Jews have tinkered with it and fiddled with it, this and that, but they haven't reconstructed it from the bottom up. And I think then they're holding Christians to something that some Christians would not like to be held to, who would like to change that. So both groups then, in terms of relations, have an opportunity when they come to these bumps in the road where it looks like Paul is saying something derogatory about Jewish identity or Jewish behavior or Torah or so on, to stop and ask, is that a translation that represents an interpretation that wanted to read Paul that way?
Yeah.
Shouldn't we stop and reinvestigate it rather than continue back and forth accepting that as a truth that we're different about? and we take different sides on, and we maybe manage it, maybe we ignore it a little, maybe we emphasize it a little. So that's the kind of thing I think this can offer to us, to stop, just to full stop and say, do we really know who we're talking about here, and what the options would be, the alternatives would be, that could offer a much different world going forward. There would be no European destruction of the Jews.
Mm.
It wouldn't have happened in the way that it happened. It wouldn't have been supported. It wouldn't have ever grown in the German culture because it was a Christian culture. It just wouldn't have happened. And I don't know what would happen, or there can be unintended negative consequences I can't even imagine, but that would not have happened in the way that it has, and the way that Christians still talk about Jews and Judaism. In fact, I talk to people all the time who say something like, well, of course, oh yeah, yeah. But then the next thing they say, and maybe they don't know what the word means, they say, yeah, but of course the law was obsolete. Well, just got done agreeing with me that he still cared about doing the Torah and teaching from it. Now you're saying it's obsolete. You don't even realize this is so built into Christian perceptions and language. It's not just ideas. It's the words reinforce these interpretations, and people are stuck there. And I think there's a way to get unstuck. I don't think I can get us all the way there, but I think I've got an idea, and some others do too, that we're sharing, and you do as well. I know, Ryan, I appreciate what you're doing. I hope that answers your question. It's not simple.
Yeah, it does.
But it is a decision to try it.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. And I mean, I know something we've talked about and that I've emphasized in various ways, shapes, and forms is even just the way, we think of Paul as a Pharisee and as a proud Pharisee. I mean, that right there is, of course, one element of a within Paul within Judaism, vantage point. And boy, does that change the game when you see that, he lists that as a credential that in Philippians 3, that he expects his audience to appraise in a positive way.
Exactly.
And so when you start thinking, and even Acts, refers to him as a Pharisee as well. So when you start looking at that, and then you compare that to how that term is used, as in such a derogatory, insulting way, even in popular culture, but certainly within, Christian theology and culture. If we can maybe rethink some of these terms and reframe them, it can really, I think, help to remove some of the barriers and some of the hostility. It's not going to eliminate, of course, as we both well know, the differences that exist, the big differences that exist. But I think some of the hostility can be removed. And I think that's something I personally, and I know I think you would agree, I think that's something Paul would be proud of and would be happy to see happen.
Yeah. It's the value judgment. I mean, that's what makes it racism. It's a value judgment. Not that you see a person has a different color or different color eyes, but you don't generally make a value judgment from eyes, sometimes from hair color, but not from eyes. Right. And yet for skin, there's a value judgment. In the case of Christians talking about Jews and Judaism, there's a value judgment, a negative value judgment built deeply into the Christian sense of self as superior. And so getting at that is not easy, but it's important. I think it's important. And, Paul's not everything, but Paul's a part of this that I think can be challenged at least. And,
I mean, obviously when it comes down to it, it's the text and it's the exegesis is where these debates really are. The battle is, I guess we would say, is fought, but the implications are so very important. And I appreciate how your work seeks to incorporate that. Mark, we're running out of time here. I just appreciate, this conversation. But I do want to finish up our conversation with just kind of looking ahead with where we are. I'm sure for you, even considering where we started this conversation of how things were in the 90s. And I think you even said, I think you used the word that some people would kind of look at some of your ideas and viewpoints as, oh, that's cute. That's a cute, thing that this guy's, but they just weren't taken seriously. So I'm sure it's very satisfying to see how Paul within Judaism has become really, I would say, an established viewpoint within New Testament studies. And though, look, you've got plenty of miles left, but I'm grateful for that. But I want to wrap this up by hearing your thoughts on where you feel like this perspective, and I'm just going to say movement, maybe that's not the best term, but this perspective or school of thought is heading. And what are some of the challenges for those who would like to see this perspective continue to advance? What are your thoughts about where things are and where things are going, Mark?
Yeah. Well, I will say that the Society of Biblical Literature, as you know, you were present, we asked these questions in the last couple of years.
Yeah.
Where do you think it's going? And different scholars that represent these views have emphasized different aspects of that. So there's many aspects of when you change a paradigm, you open a door into a whole new world to explore. And I think there's lots of things I could say here. I think on the negative side, as something becomes cool, if you will, everybody wants to own that, and so in one sense, it's going to get trivialized. It's going to get broadened. It's going to represent views that really some of us original folks would not place on the map that we were trying to create, where we were trying to go. And it also can become revolting in a negative way. When something becomes cool, a lot of people don't want to be part of whatever the popular thing is. That different kind of personality is exactly the kind of personality attracted to new readings. Ironically, and then there's a sort of a distaste. They have to be part of a group that's a Paul within Judaism group that these particular guys coined terms and did whatever, and they're the big shots in it. That can be very repelling, and I get that.
Sure.
That's just human group nature. That's just dynamics. So I think that's a negative. Another negative is, and I've already seen this, and I mentioned one case where I think Paul within Judaism without Torah. To me, that, and the comparisons are then made to late 19th century, early 20th century Reform Jews doing what they were doing, and de-emphasizing traditional interpretations of Torah and so on. I think that misses largely, but I think that's going to happen a lot. I've seen it start to happen where really the kind of Judaism that's being described is a mini Christianity. Changed a few words, not using church, not using Christian, but not really changing the concept. And so, and through the back door in these, then you still see, okay, we're not going to call him a convert, but everything about him in the description and in the persona that comes out is a convert. And so there's going to be that kind of lipstick on it type of thing that it's going to, and I find that, of course, very aggravating because that's then difficult to get at. Here's somebody that wants to do it. I want to be welcoming, but what they're doing is actually subverting the movement, if you will. And whether it's intentional or not intentional, I don't think it's probably intentional, but anyhow, that's some negative. On the positive side, I'd like to think that once you hear the critique, you cannot go back all the way. I'd like to think we've gotten far enough putting this on the academic table as a reasonable, exegetically based approach to the study of the New Testament, that there's no turning back to just the way it was. That it has to be qualified. And I think that's what's happening. When you talk about full rooms or you talk about dissertations that are being published and other works that are being published, there tends to now be people coming who may not like it or may not be persuaded or not know much about it. And they might even, their natural reaction is actually kind of a negative one. But once they're exposed to it, I like to think there's no going back to proof before, where the assumption was that this was crazy. When I first would say this to people, it just didn't even, you could just see it just didn't register. And now I think it's registered. It should have to be engaged by true scholarship. Now, by confessional biases, it doesn't have to be, and they can use all the informal and formal fallacies to defend the flock from this terrible doctrine that's going to pollute them and take away their faith and all the other scary stuff that can happen. But I do think that in academic circles, the study of Paul, the study of the New Testament is changing, and I don't think it can be as naive, maybe naively projecting the traditional views. I think that's a bridge I think we've now crossed.
Yeah.
I don't think that most people are Paul within Judaism scholarships by any means, confessional people around the world, but I think they know that it's there, and they may or may not want to engage it yet, but I think that there isn't the same innocence about it. That's where I would say. Now, where should it go? We need translations.
Yeah.
We need to start exploring. A great case was just in Sweden at the International Society of Biblical Literature. I get this secondhand because I wasn't present. That the Within Judaism book, New Testament Within Judaism book, that was edited by Zetterholm and Runnison, Karen Zetterholm. One of the reviewers didn't think that the book did a very good job of setting out the case for why we should do Within Judaism. And one of the reviewers thought it was no longer time to keep explaining why we have to do Within Judaism. We need to just move on and do it. These are two scholars at the same panel, at the same
people
session.
in the same room. Yeah. It's wild.
And so I think we really do need to move on. Those of us who buy the basic paradigm change, we need to move on. There's a lot of texts that are difficult texts or interesting texts, or maybe they'll explode in ways that we don't see. Most of my work has gone directions I did not foresee, because you're starting with a whole new set of questions and exploring different methodologies and of course the philological part, looking up these words and sayings and usages. And even past that, the manuscript decisions that have been made for the Greek manuscripts that are put together in our versions that we make our translations from, those are all made by people with an interpretation of the New Testament from a different point of view.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be very interesting to see how things develop in the years and decades to come. But your work, obviously Paula Fredrickson and Pamela Eisenbaum and others as well have just done such a great job of really laying a foundation. And thankfully, each of you is still continuing to contribute and build and invest in folks that are wanting to see things move forward. So, my view is that Paul Within Judaism not only helps us understand Paul better, but it really does, as we discussed just a few minutes ago, it really does improve the potential for better relationships between Jews and Christians, on a very, grassroots level. And that is certainly something that I know we both hope to see continue to advance. But there's a lot of work to do, as we've said, on the scholarship side and working out the implications of Paul Within Judaism. But thankfully things are progressing. But Mark, I just want to thank you here for everything that you've done in this regard, and I'm looking forward to what you're going to continue to contribute to these efforts in the days to come. So really appreciate you, Mark. Thank you.
Well, thank you. If I may say the same, I really appreciate what you're doing and some others who are breaking this down for interested people who are not going to necessarily do the kind of academic study and read all the essays, and they're busy people or whatever. And I very much appreciate what you're doing. It's one of the places that gives me great joy when I see, of course it gives you joy to do your own work, but when you see it,
right.
Changing and being brought to the next audiences by someone other than yourself. I mean, that's just a real moment of pleasure. And so I thank you, and I thank those who listen to you for considering these things and trying to wrestle with them. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks, Mark, and we'll keep this moving forward. Enjoyed it. Thank you. Hey, I would love to connect with you further, so feel free to leave a comment or send me a private message. And the best way for us to stay in touch is to sign up for the Bridge Builders Forum email at bridgebuildersforum.com. This will keep you informed of cutting-edge resources and opportunities for us to connect and learn together. Additionally, the Bridge Builders Forum is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Your support helps us create content that overcomes misunderstandings and advances ideas that build bridges between Jews and Christians. So we'll be back soon to discuss more ideas that help Jews and Christians better understand their faith, the Bible, and each other.